With us now is Dan Perry, former chief editor for the Associated Press in Europe, Africa, and the Middle East, and opinion contributor to our partners at thehill.com. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
Good morning. So President Trump threatening those additional sanctions on Russia as the White House also goes after Russian cryptocurrency exchanges. I have to ask you, what pressure is this going to actually put on Putin to come to the negotiating table after 3 years of war?
I sincerely doubt it'll make a difference. You know, the sanctions against Russia, banking sanctions against Russia, trade embargo essentially on Russia by most of the West, including the U.S., has been in existence. And Russia has found ways to get around it by finding new partners, by finding ways to get to energy markets circuitously through Azerbaijan and other countries. I think mainly it's messaging. You know, Trump has been accused of acting almost like a puppet of Putin, having adopted the Kremlin's messaging and narratives, and in some cases saying utterly nonsensical things that make him look like he's in the thrall of Putin. I kind of sense that this is an effort to counter that and to create the impression that, in fact, he's equidistant from both sides, putting pressure on both sides, and somehow to regain the credibility that he certainly has lost with America's allies because of events of the past month.
To create the impression, that is interesting. We should mention the Trump administration has even pulled back on Ukraine's access to satellites. Dan, how is that impacting the war on the ground, especially with these overnight attacks we just saw?
It could be devastating if they really, really go all the way. I mean, Ukraine depends on this, depends on the satellites and other technology provided by the West and by the Americans for basic battlefield intel. I think they're going to clearly try to force Ukraine to come to the table and do a deal in terms that before the U.S. election would have been unfathomable, and that many critics are going to charge essentially amounts to surrender or a deal on Putin's terms. The question at the end of the day is whether a way will be found to provide Ukraine with A, security guarantees, B, some sort of consolation prize, maybe in the form of, let's say, a fast track to European Union membership, so that it doesn't look like they lost the war. If the sense, I think, in Europe in particular, is that if Putin ends up thinking that his aggression was handsomely rewarded, then he will turn next to Moldova, to the Baltic countries, and quite possibly Eastern European nations like Romania, where indeed Putin already stands accused of having tried to interfere in the November election to bring about victory by a pro-Putin candidate.
All right, Dan, let's move on to the Middle East, specifically Israel, Gaza. President Trump now threatening Hamas with, quote, hell to pay after members of his administration met with the group. We know Stephen Witkoff did just a few days ago. This is a major change in the U.S. policy of not negotiating directly with terrorists. How effective is this new strategy going to be in getting the Phase 2 ceasefire talks back in motion?
Well, the strategy of not negotiating with terrorists was always a little bit of a pretense. I mean, in various ways, Israel's negotiating with Hamas, albeit indirectly through Qatar. But because Qatar is the bankroller of Hamas and a major supporter of Hamas, you are, in effect, still negotiating with Hamas. The major leverage that Trump has here is that it appears that he's willing to give Israel a green light to go back to war and essentially level what's left of Gaza. Now, that's only a threat if you're dealing with rational players who would like not to be leveled. In the case of Hamas, you could say that they're negotiating hard and pretending not to care, but I'm kind of convinced, because if you look at what happened in Gaza over the past year and 4 months, the devastation that has been visited on Hamas would have created a surrender by almost any other an antagonist that I've seen in history. And yet they're hanging on, and they seem to be genuinely suicidal. And they have radicalized the population to the point where there is some support for this among the people of Gaza. So I think the one thing that may prevent a renewal of the war is the fact that it would be unpopular in Israel. And Netanyahu, even if he somehow incredibly manages to survive this debacle, by which I mean the failure of October 7th and everything since, he still has elections next year. And when 70 to 75% of the people are telling the government that they want the war to end and they want the hostages prioritized, it will be difficult politically for Netanyahu to resume the war when it's quite understood that contains within it the likelihood of the sacrifice of the lives of the remaining hostages, and there are believed to be about 24, 25 living hostages still in the hands of Hamas.
All right, thank you for that insight, Dan. Let's come back to the States. The White House just announcing cutting $400 million in funding for Columbia University, claiming they didn't do enough to protect Jewish students from those pro-Palestinian protests we saw last year. This is a clear message of support for Israel. What kind of message does that send to other universities that were plagued with these same protests last year?
Well, you know, it somehow became acceptable in the U.S. to essentially support Hamas. And not all free speech is protected. That somehow was, even though Hamas clearly has emerged as one of the most diabolical terrorist groups in the history of history. Um, the White House is making clear that this is hate speech. It will not be tolerated, and to the degree that it can essentially blackmail the universities into not tolerating it, so it will do. This factors into a bigger thing. The Ivy League universities in the United States are widely seen by many people, including increasingly many American Jews, who are a major source of funding for these universities and a major source of support for the Democratic Party. These universities are seen as having gone full progressive, as having become places where you do not have free speech, except for anti-Semitism. And essentially, there are federal funds that these universities benefit from that will potentially be taken away, not just from Columbia, but from others. The University of Pennsylvania has clearly responded to this with various moves, essentially walking back DEI and other such things. You're seeing that at Harvard as well. I think there is a course correction that is being required by the federal government of these academic institutions that have gone very far left, and which has translated into hatred of Israel and acceptance of jihadi terrorism.
All right, Dan Perry, we always appreciate your time. And again, the context is always so excellent. Thank you.